The prairie woke before the sun, breathing frost into the low places and stretching pale light across a land that never apologized for its hardness. Wind slid through the grass like a patient hand, bending what could bend and breaking what would not. At the edge of that wide silence, where the ground dipped as if the earth itself had grown tired, a dugout cabin held fast. Its roof was sod and stubborn hope. Its walls were packed soil and memory. From a distance, it looked like a scar. Up close, it felt like a heartbeat. She rose before daylight, as she always did, because the cold was easier to meet when it had not yet sharpened its teeth. Her hands knew the morning without instruction. Stoke the stove. Shake the ashes. Count the potatoes. Measure the flour as if scarcity were a companion that could be reasoned with. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned that waste was a kind of betrayal. Nothing about her asked for attention. Everything about her endured. The town sat a mile away, neat in its wooden lines and proud windows, and it had opinions about the dugout. Opinions fell like crumbs from the mouths of those who did not know hunger. They called it a hole. They called it a joke. They said a woman living under the ground must have buried herself on purpose. Their laughter never reached her ears directly, but it found its way into the room anyway, thin as smoke, clinging to corners. She learned to breathe through it. She had come to the prairie with faith enough to last a season and a promise that did not survive the winter. The first man had been all talk and quick confidence, bright as tin and just as hollow. He liked the idea of her resilience more than the work of honoring it. When the land asked for patience, he grew restless. When she asked for steadiness, he offered excuses. Leaving did not trouble him. Staying would have required a deeper courage. He took his shadow and went east, and the prairie did not remember him. What remained was the dugout and the quiet arithmetic of survival. She planted when the ground allowed it and mended when it did not. She bartered eggs for lamp oil, pride for salt. She listened to the weather the way others listened to sermons. The land taught her to be exact and honest. It did not forgive, but it was fair. On a morning when the sky carried a bruised color she did not like, she walked into town with a basket balanced against her hip. The storekeeper weighed her eggs with a thumb pressed too hard on the scale, smiling as if the gesture were friendly. The preacher nodded, his blessing already spent elsewhere. Women passed her and let their words trail behind them like loose thread. She felt the old pinch at the base of her ribs and let it go. Pain, she had learned, was loud only if you gave it your voice. She did not notice him at first. He was the kind of man the eye learned to trust only after the mind caught up. He stood near the hitching rail, adjusting a strap with care that bordered on tenderness. His coat was worn but clean. His posture suggested he had been taught to make room rather than claim it. When the wind kicked dust into her face and she flinched, he stepped between without looking at her, taking the grit on his own collar as if it were nothing worth remarking. Later, when a wheel on her borrowed cart complained and then surrendered, he knelt and fixed it with the patience of someone who understood how small failures could become disasters if ignored. He did not ask questions. He did not explain himself. When he finished, he nodded once, as if to the work itself, and returned to his place by the rail. She thanked him. The word felt thin. He answered with a small inclination of his head, a gesture that did not seek reward. The town noticed the exchange and misread it immediately. Curiosity sharpened into speculation. Speculation hardened into judgment. She felt it like a change in pressure. She also felt, beneath that, something steadier than fear. The man had not lingered. He had not offered a story to soften the moment. He had not asked her to be anything other than present. The days shortened. The sun learned new angles. Frost stitched the mornings together, seam by careful seam. She carried wood and water, and a growing sense that the land was gathering itself. Old voices in town spoke of winters that taught lessons no schoolhouse could hold. She listened from the edge, measuring truth by the weight it carried. When she returned to the dugout, she packed earth along a drafty corner and thanked the soil for its patience. He came again, not to town this time, but to the shallow rise where the dugout kept its low profile against the wind. He brought nails and a length of salvaged timber and no explanation. He worked until the hinge no longer sang and the door closed like it meant to stay. He accepted stew when she offered it, ate with the careful gratitude of someone who knew hunger's long memory, and left before dusk. Their conversation was sparse and clean. It did not hurry. It did not promise. It rested. When he was gone, the dugout felt altered, not larger but more complete, as if the space had been acknowledged by someone who understood it. She sat by the stove and let the warmth do its quiet work. Outside, the wind practiced new notes. Inside, she folded her hands and considered the strange mercy of being seen without being claimed. That night, snow whispered against the roof, testing, learning. She lay awake and counted the breaths of the house. The earth held. The stove held. Her resolve held. Somewhere between sleep and listening, she understood that the town's laughter was a thin shield against a vast weather, and that the dugout, mocked and overlooked, had been built for exactly this kind of knowing. By morning, the horizon wore a color that made the birds restless and the cattle uneasy. She stepped outside and tasted iron on the air. The prairie did not shout its warnings. It offered them softly to those who paid attention. She turned back toward the dugout, toward the life she had made with careful hands, and felt the story lean forward, as if the land itself were about to speak. Winter arrived without ceremony, as if it had always been there and the rest of the year had only been visiting. The cold settled into the prairie's bones and stayed. Snow smoothed the land until fences lost their purpose and distance learned new meanings. The dugout drew closer to the earth, its walls holding warmth the way a cupped hand holds breath. Inside, she learned the sound of each board and stone, the language of small comforts that add up to survival. He came when the light was good enough to work and left before it turned brittle. He never announced himself. The door would open with a careful knock, and there he would be, shoulders dusted with snow, eyes steady, as if he had been listening from far off and decided the moment was right. He brought what he could spare: a sack of grain, a strip of canvas, once a book with its spine repaired, the pages smelling faintly of smoke. He did not explain the gifts. He treated them like facts, and in doing so made them easier to accept. Their words were few, but they learned to read what the other left unsaid. She spoke with her hands and the rhythm of her work. He answered by noticing what needed doing and doing it well. He never lingered in the way men sometimes did, measuring space as if it were a claim. He took the chair she offered and left it where it belonged. When he smiled, it was brief and unpracticed, like a habit he was still learning. The town took note. It had nothing better to do once the field slept. Looks sharpened. Silence grew opinionated. The preacher mentioned propriety from the pulpit, careful not to look in her direction. The storekeeper raised his prices, as if moral judgment could be tallied. She felt the pressure of it and set her jaw. She had learned long ago that shame was a luxury she could not afford. If kindness came with consequences, she would still take the kindness. The first man's absence returned to her in small, uninvited ways. A song she could no longer finish. A habit of listening for a step that would not come. She did not tell the second man about it. Some stories were too heavy to be lifted twice. Instead, she watched the way he handled silence, not filling it, not fearing it. There was a safety in that, a sense of room enough to breathe. One afternoon, the wind rose and fell like a restless sleeper. Snow lifted from the ground and traveled sideways, searching for weakness. He tightened the door and checked the roof, his movements economical, his attention complete. She handed him tools and learned, without instruction, how to work beside him. Their shoulders brushed once, an accident that carried no spark, only acknowledgement. She felt a warmth that surprised her, not sharp or sudden, but deep and durable. They shared a meal that evening. The stew was thin, but honest. He ate slowly, as if to honor the effort that had gone into it. When she reached for the pot, he stopped her with a small shake of his head and served her first. The gesture was quiet and unremarkable, and it landed with more force than a speech. She realized then that respect could be practiced without an audience. Outside, the sky held its breath. The horizon blurred, and the sun became a rumor. Old warnings drifted back to her, stories of winters that closed their fists and did not open them for days. She watched him as he pulled on his coat, memorizing the way he prepared to leave, the care he took to secure what he did not own. He looked at the sky once, then at the dugout, and his mouth tightened in a way that suggested concern rather than fear. He returned the next day, and the next, each visit shorter as the cold grew sharper. They spoke of practical things: snow loads, fuel, the importance of staying put. He did not tell her what to do. He offered information and trusted her to decide. The town receded in her thoughts, its judgments dulled by the simple fact of being busy together. Survival left little room for spectacle. On the fourth morning, she woke to a sound she did not recognize. The wind had found a new voice, lower and more insistent, as if the prairie were clearing its throat. She stepped outside and felt the air bite. The sky wore that same uneasy color, deeper now, layered with a promise she did not like. When he arrived, there was snow in his beard and urgency in his stride. They worked without speaking, reinforcing what could be reinforced, bringing water inside, setting things where they would be easiest to reach. The dugout felt smaller with purpose filling it, tighter and more alive. When he finished, he did not leave. He stood by the door and listened, the way a man listens for a child crying in the dark. She met his gaze and saw her own concern reflected there, clean and unadorned. If the storm came, it would not ask permission. If it did not, the land would remember this moment anyway. She nodded once, a decision made and understood. He removed his coat and hung it carefully, as if to say he was not a visitor now, not exactly. The wind pressed against the door and was denied. Inside, the stove glowed. Between them, something solid took shape, not named and not hurried, strong enough to wait. As night fell, snow began to fall with purpose, thick and steady, erasing edges and softening sound. The dugout held its warmth. She ladled soup and felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was not bracing alone. The storm gathered itself beyond the walls, patient and immense, and the story leaned closer, ready to test what had been quietly built. The storm arrived like a decision already made. Snow did not fall so much as advance, pressing the world flat and white, erasing distance, until even memory seemed close at hand. The wind lost its wandering ways and chose a direction, driving the cold hard enough to make breath feel borrowed. Inside the dugout, the walls held steady, the earth doing what it had always done when asked properly. She fed the stove and listened, counting the sounds that meant safety and the ones that did not. He kept watch by the door, not as a guard, but as a witness. The wind worried the hinges and then moved on, frustrated. They spoke only when needed. Wood, water, time. Their movements fit together without rehearsal, each aware of the other's reach and rhythm. Fear hovered, present but not in command. She noticed how he checked on her without fuss, how his questions were shaped to give her room to answer honestly. By mid-morning, the first knock came, thin and uncertain, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. She felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to measure risk and ration mercy. He met her eyes and waited. It was her home. The choice was hers. She opened the door, and the storm tried to rush in, clawing at warmth. A neighbor stood there, face raw with cold, pride stripped to bone. The dugout took him in, without comment. The knocks came again and again, each one heavier with need. The room filled with breath and damp wool, with a low music of survival shared. People she had passed in silence now met her gaze and looked away, embarrassed by gratitude. She did not make a ledger of it. The storm did not allow for bookkeeping. She moved among them, offering cups, rearranging space, keeping the fire fed. Leadership found her and stayed. At some point, he faltered. It was subtle, the way strength often does when it is finally spent. His hand missed the latch. His shoulders dipped. She caught the change before it announced itself. She guided him to the bench and pressed a cup into his hands, felt the heat of him and the cold behind his eyes. He tried to wave her off, a habit older than hunger. She stayed. The storm raged on, indifferent to bravery. She tended him with the same care she had learned to give the land. No drama. No fear allowed to grow legs. She wrapped him in blankets and kept him drinking, watched the color return to his face in increments too small to celebrate. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in that gaze settled. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. He had been steady for others. Now he let himself be held by her steadiness. The dugout breathed. Outside, the town suffered. Roofs failed. Drifts climbed and refused to be moved. Inside, the room adjusted, making space for everyone and everything that needed it. Children slept against walls they had never believed in. The preacher prayed softly and did not perform. The storekeeper's hands shook as he passed a cup he had not paid for. The storm equalized without asking permission. When night came, it did not bring quiet. The wind learned new ways to speak, lower and more insistent, testing the roof with a patience that felt personal. Snow pressed and pressed again. The earth answered with silence, the kind that means holding. She felt the weight above them and trusted what she had built. She trusted the hands that had helped her build it. He woke before dawn, fever broken, eyes clear. He did not thank her. He took up work where it waited, quiet as before. She watched him and felt a warmth that was not the stove's doing. It did not demand anything. It simply existed, earned and unafraid of time. The storm still had hours left in it, perhaps days, but something essential had already been decided. As the light crept back into the world, pale and cautious, the wind eased just enough to be noticed. People slept. The dugout stood. She sat by the door and listened to the land as it released its grip, one careful breath at a time. He joined her without a word, close enough to share warmth, far enough to respect it. They watched the storm spend itself, and in that watching understood that endurance was not loud, and love, when it came, would arrive the same way. The storm did not end so much as loosen its grip, releasing the land inch by inch, as if testing whether the world beneath it still remembered how to stand. Light returned without warmth, thin and honest, revealing drifts shaped like frozen waves and fences buried to their throats. The dugout emerged from the white as it always had, low and unassuming, its strength hidden in plain sight. She stepped outside and felt the quiet press against her ears, a silence earned rather than given. People stirred behind her, gathering their courage along with their coats. Faces looked different in the daylight, softened by survival, sharpened by humility. The town had come to her in need, and now it stood uncertain, as if unsure how to return to its old shapes. She moved among them, steady as before, pointing out paths that could be cleared, tasks that could be done together. Authority settled on her without resistance. It fit because it was already worn. He worked at her side, still conserving strength, his presence a calm weight against the vastness of what remained. When they lifted a beam together, she felt the ease of shared effort, the way trust shortens the distance between two people. He watched her as she organized, not with awe, but with understanding. He had always seen the pattern in her work. Now others did too. They ventured toward town once the paths were passable, a slow procession across a landscape remade. What they found was damage and quiet courage in equal measure. Homes sagged. Animals lay where they had fallen. People stood in doorways and stared, counting what was gone and what remained. The dugout became a reference point, a place named with respect rather than ridicule. The earth house that had been mocked now stood as proof that wisdom sometimes looks like humility. The first man's name surfaced in conversation like a relic, a reminder of choices made and unmade. She felt no pull toward it, only a distant gratitude for the lesson it had cost her. She had built something better from the absence. He noticed the way she did not flinch and understood what that meant. The past had loosened its hold. In the days that followed, work filled the hours. Repairs were made. Losses were counted and mourned without spectacle. The preacher helped dig. The storekeeper extended credit without conditions. Children carried water and learned the shape of responsibility. The dugout remained a gathering place, not because it was grand, but because it was safe. She kept the stove going and the door open, and the land seemed to approve. One evening, when the sky took on a gentler color and the wind remembered how to rest, he stayed after the others had gone. They sat by the fire and listened to it speak in its small domestic way. He did not reach for her. He did not promise anything he could not keep. He told her, simply, that he intended to stay as long as she would have him, to work the land and the quiet between them with the same care he gave a hinge or a beam. The words were plain. The meaning was not. She considered him the dugout, the land beyond the door. She thought of how the earth had held them when the sky had not. She answered without ceremony, not because it was unimportant, but because it was already true. Together felt like the right size for the future. Enough and no more. Spring would come in its own time. The prairie did not hurry its gifts. For now there was work, warmth, and a shared understanding that survival was sweeter when it was not solitary. The town moved differently around the dugout, slower, more thoughtful, as if the storm had taught it to look twice at what it dismissed. She watched this change without bitterness. Some lessons needed weather to teach them. On the last night before the road reopened and the world remembered its distances, she stepped outside alone. The stars returned, sharp and innumerable. She breathed the cold and felt it answer her. The dugout behind her held a light that did not flicker. Inside waited a man who understood quiet, a life shaped by patience rather than promise. She did not know what stories would come next. She knew only that she would meet them as she always had, with hands ready and heart open, trusting the ground beneath her feet. The prairie stretched on, vast and indifferent, and yet it had made room for them. Somewhere between the earth and the sky, between endurance and grace, the story settled into its truth. What was mocked had endured. What endured had become a home. And for anyone listening closely, the land seemed to whisper that strength often lives where no one thinks to look, waiting for the storm that finally proves it.